Welcome to Belonging at the Top, driving performance through people. The podcast where leadership gets real and people come first. Your hosts are Dr. Natalie Parks, psychologist, behavior analyst, best-selling author, and your go-to expert for dismantling systems of injustice while building equitable, high-performing teams. And Anthony Butler, leadership coach, thought leader, speaker, and master of helping leaders unlock their team's full potential, one breakthrough at a time. Together, they're here to tackle your toughest leadership challenges with just the right mix of science, strategy, and a sprinkle of humor. In this episode, we welcome Dr. Christina Grove as our first Belonging at the Top podcast guest. Dr. Grove shares her perspective on belonging as it applies to educators and their work in the classroom and the community.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Belonging at the Top. Today we have a very special guest and longtime friend of both Anthony and I,
Yes.
Dr. Christina Grove.
It's good to be here with you guys.
Good to see you.
Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely.
It's a Truman State University reunion.
It is.
It is.
Even though I graduated from Northeast Missouri State, I don't know where y'all went, but
I mean, you started there.
I did. But anyway.
I graduated from school, so it's fine. I didn't graduate from Truman State either.
Oh my God. Anyway, welcome as our first official guest. We're recording live at Lindenwood University. Thanks again to Dr. Maggie Pavone and the Spelman Center here at Lindenwood University for allowing us to use the space once again. But you are our first in-person guest. So
I am honored.
thank you very much, Dr. Grove.
I am honored.
So this is just a conversation, free flowing. You know what we talk about here, belonging and where it comes from. So just tell us about kind of like your leadership journey and what belonging means to you.
Absolutely. So I serve a local school district as the coordinator for culturally and linguistically responsive practices in social emotional learning, which is a very long title, which is why we use acronyms in education. But the essence of that work is making sure that all students are seen, heard, and valued in classroom spaces, because we recognize that in order for them to learn, in order for them to access the academic work that we are putting in front of them. Loretta Hammond talks about the fact that one of her brain rules is the brain first seeks to mitigate danger and create connection, right? And so that's the essence of my role, is helping teachers understand that and build that into their classroom spaces. And so my leadership journey is about how I work to create those spaces in my classroom first with my own students, and the trial and error over the years of what that meant, right? I didn't get it right all the time,
Right.
But that's how I kind of got to this space.
So how do you, I'm thinking about in the parallels of, we've talked about, you need to cultivate belonging and somebody needs to feel that they belong in the corporate structure in order to perform their best, right? Mm-hmm. And that's very parallel to students. I'm wondering, and I want to talk about the students, but I'm wondering first, do teachers also need to feel that way? And how does your position fit into kind of not just helping teachers cultivate that in the classroom, but cultivating it more building wide for the teachers?
Absolutely. I think teachers absolutely need to feel that way. And that was, again, when I talk about trial and error, right? Trying to figure out how I got to this space. Initially, in taking on my role, I was simply student focused, right? I need to teach teachers how to do this.
Right.
And it took a while for me to understand that teachers who often don't create those spaces in their classrooms are because they don't have a sense of that for themselves, right? And oftentimes teachers that don't create spaces of belonging in classrooms need it modeled for them, right? It's not something, I don't believe that creating a sense of belonging is innate, because empathy is a skill, right? We tend to think that people are naturally empathetic. People might be more predisposed to it than others, but it is a skill that people have learned along the way. And so part of my work has been, how do I model and teach that for teachers? How do I understand that just like if a student doesn't know 2 + 2, you don't get upset with them. You just simply teach them so that they can do the next thing you need them to do. Rather than finger pointing with teachers, like, how do I model for you? How do I have conversations with you so that you have a strong desire you have the skill to it, right? And the desire and the skill to make it happen in your classroom space.
Right. I think I think education is just so unique in that, like, from your leadership role, you are training leaders in the classroom to serve students, and yet they're also employees, right? And so teachers often have this kind of dual purpose of, I have a leader and I'm an employee, maybe mid-level employee if we equate it to corporate world, and yet those who I'm serving are students, they're kids who come with their own set of chaos and experiences that often differ vastly, right? So depending on district, but knowing a little bit about your district, I know your students come from vastly different backgrounds, right? And so, and your teachers sometimes come from similar backgrounds because they grew up and now teach there, but you also have teachers who don't know anything about the community. And so how do you navigate some of that? Like, how do we foster belonging, and how do you help foster belonging with that teacher so that teacher can then replicate that model?
Absolutely. But before you answer that, I think the other nuance I want to add about educators, I think, is that it's not only is it's a workspace for the educator, but it's also a personal point for the family and the kids, but it's also a quasi-governmental function as well.
It is.
So you get your stakeholders are the community, government agencies, both state and federal, local. It's the family, it's the neighborhoods. And so you, as an educator, you've got to deal with all of that. And then as an administrator in education, you've got to deal with the employee side and all those stakeholders as well. I want to just add that nuance, adding the external factors. But with that being said, answer.
And those nuances can feel diametrically opposed at times, right?
Often.
What it is that families are looking for in spaces and what government entities are requiring of schools can be vastly different. And it's hard to negotiate and navigate that. I think, to your question, when I think of our new teacher orientation for the last couple of years, the first thing that we've tried to orient teachers in is their own sense of identity, right? We have a lot of conversations around who are you? Because in order to do that work with students, you have to understand what you are bringing to the table. It's what helps you understand your implicit bias. We do a lot of work around culture and understanding culture in the space. So we do a lot of culture mapping in the beginning. Like, who are you? What are the cultural identities that compose who you are? Because those things will then shape how you see the girl who claps her hands when she's making a point, right? Or the kid that says, whatever, bruh. And so having to say to teachers, and we called everybody dude. If you were Gen Xer, you called everybody dude and bruh are the same thing. But but having to understand that. So we start with a lot of identity work. And from there, we then sort of begin to examine how what you bring into the classroom and what your students bring into the classroom, how they can clash, and how you can sort of understand the clash before it happens, right? There's also a lot of work about understanding and honoring humanity as a whole, right? My district specifically, we have 3 pillars, which probably becomes identifying for someone if you know my district. But our pillars are humanized, personalized, and problematized. And we spend a lot of time in that humanized space. And so how do you see students and families as human beings? And what does it mean to honor their dignity? Some of the work that I've had to do within myself and conversations that I also try to have with colleagues is, how do you also do that humanizing with teachers? Because what can occur is if everybody feels like the focus on humanizing is only on students and nobody's humanizing teachers, teachers get real bitter. They get really upset. And that can turn, quite frankly, onto students and parents. And what I feel like I'm seeing a lot of in the current educational space is a whole bunch of finger pointing at everybody is mad at everybody else, right? And I think it's because we don't do a lot of humanizing of the other.
So in an educational context then, because I know in most management spaces, in talking about human resources, there's a school of thought that says it's not your customer who's first, in your case, the student, it's your employee. So you treat your employees like that's your first priority. And then if you treat your employees right, then they will then treat your customers right or serve your customers better.
Right.
So does that apply to the education space from your experience?
That's a great question. I don't know in educational spaces. I think it has to be a simultaneous thing, right? I think because we are dealing with children and the lives of children, ultimately they have to come first. The conversation, so there's a lot of conversations about what is student-centered versus what's teacher-centered, right? We have to be student-centered, but I don't think that student-centered is so diametrically opposed to doing what honors teachers, right? And so how do we find that balance? How do we put students at the center of everything we do, but make sure that as we are doing that, we are honoring the people who are on the front lines of the students that we love. Right?
Well, I think a part of honoring students is honoring the people who are caring for students, right? And I'm thinking on the more personal level, and, one of the values that I was brought up in my household is like, husband values wife, because wife was the main caretaker of the children. And if she's not valued, then she can't take care of the children in a way that honors them, right? And so if we take that as a parallel, the only way to truly honor children is to also be honoring the teachers at the same time. So not to say that's the only thing, but it seems to me at least that it needs to be a necessary part of the puzzle.
I think it is an important component of the puzzle. I also think about what it models for kids, right? So not just treat teachers well so that they take care of kids, but what does it mean for all of us to show dignity and respect and honor for all the humans that we come in contact with, right? So in educational spaces, you will often, and you used to especially often hear a lot about the importance of building relationships in classroom management, right? You build relationships with kids because the kids you build relationships with, you can get them to do anything for you. And I struggle with that because it's transactional, right? I don't build relationships with my students so that you will do my work. I build relationships with students because we're in this bad boy for 6 hours a day. If we don't know how to coexist with each other, we will all be miserable, right? And human beings are relational. And so, yes, there is a take care of teachers so that teachers take care of students. But there is also what do we want to model for our students, and what kind of world do we want our students to see? Right. And do we want our students to see a world where we use the people that work for us, but we don't see them as human beings, and we don't value their innate worth as human beings? So I think that's also part of it.
Well, I'm wondering, like, all the things that you're saying, and given from my perspective, understanding there's bias everywhere, it seems like understanding that we are trying to humanize our students and humanize our teachers, and we're trying to create environments where students can thrive. They can learn what they need to learn. They can master the skills they need to be productive citizens, ultimately. That should not be polarizing. And yet, when we think about education right now, education is probably one of the more polarized aspects of our society, in the U.S. at least.
And let's point out that we're recording a day after the administration just signed an executive order to disband the Department of Education. So I know I just timestamped the video, but I think that's
it's important context. It's important context.
It's important context. That's what we're dealing with right now.
And my wonder is, and we were having a one-off conversation yesterday, but my wonder is in that context, right? So how do we make that not polarizing. Because to some people, that concept still feels like it's leaving somebody out.
Yeah.
So how do we start to bridge that gap?
I think my first thought, and this might be the social studies teacher in me, my first thought is to remember that I think we try to avoid the political nature of education,
Right.
and we can't, right? So things can be political without being polarizing, and we have yet to figure that out in educational spaces. But I also think it goes back to discussion and dialogue, right? We spend a lot of time in educational spaces debating with one another. We debate the reading wars, right? And science of reading versus balanced literacy. We debate what parent involvement should look like and shouldn't look like. We debate what should be taught in social studies classes and what should not. And we aren't having a lot of discussions with each other and dialogue with each other that has at its core the expressed intent of coming out with new learning on the other side. And we don't keep children at the center. We think we do, right? But I would even argue that our keeping children at the center is not with an understanding that they will be their own person. It is with a desire to turn them into replications of what has existed before.
What we want them to be.
Right? I remember someone saying one time, we spend more time worried about whether or not we are good descendants and less time worried about whether or not we are good ancestors. Like we are supposed to be thinking about the world that we leave them and the world that is coming ahead. And we keep trying to replicate the world that has come before us. And I think that's why we then keep having debate in educational spaces instead of dialogue on how we create something new and how we create something better for our students. I think that's my personal thought on why this discussion gets so polarizing.
So what do you think then, coming out of COVID and now in the current climate that we're in politically, like how was belonging then difficult for educators? Because if you want to keep the child first, but you still want to maintain their sense of honoring the teacher as a human, humanizing them as well, how is it then, because you've heard our episodes previously, right? How is it then, what we talk about in dealing with belonging, how is that different for educators?
I think, first of all, positive presupposition is I believe that every educator that I've ever come in contact with wants a space where students belong in the classroom.
That's why they're in education.
It's why they're in education, right? Elementary school teachers love kids. Secondary teachers love their content, but we all believe that kids...
The power of what's not said.
Right. But we all believe that, that what we're doing is in the best interest of children, right?
Right.
With that being said, when you talk about bias and how bias shapes how we show up, bias impacts how we see belonging as well, right? And who is supposed to belong and who is not supposed to belong. And so if you have a teacher, and for most of us in education, we are in education not only because we believe in the prospect of what education is supposed to be. Most of us have done it well. Most of us were the students that enjoy, like I will often say, if you put 25 teachers in a room, about 22 to 23 of them can absolutely name for you their favorite teacher and who made them love school. You'll find 2 or 3 that are like, nobody made me love school and I want to do this so that no other student has the experience that I experienced. But both of those frameworks then shape what belonging looks like to you and how you then seek to create belonging in the classroom space. Do you either seek to recreate what happened before, or do you seek to create a space that's different than what you've known before? And much of that, unfortunately, on both sides, happens without talking to students. And so I do believe that at the core of what is going to get to belonging in a space, asking, like, I can't tell you you belong in this space. You have to feel like you belong. Right. And you have to tell me what makes this space safe for you. I can't declare it a safe space for you. You can only declare it a safe space for you. And therefore, I have to have conversations with you to know what that means. We have to co-create together in a classroom space what that means. And a lot of teachers understand that. Unfortunately, not all of us do.
Right.
But in certain spaces, that's what you'll see as it relates to creating belonging in a space. How do we co-create this learning environment together? This space where we feel like it's safe to take risks, because learning only happens in struggle, right? We have to feel safe to take risks in this space in order for learning to happen. How do we create a space where harm will happen? We're humans, but what do we do, and how do we create the space where we come back from that? Restorative practices, right? So in the best spaces in education, it looks like co-creation, with the adult taking the ultimate responsibility for what happens in the space, but never absolving students for the responsibility. And therefore, if students have a partial responsibility for making that space, then they should also have a voice in what that space looks like. I don't know from a corporate sense what the equivalent of that is, but I think in educational spaces. And I would also say that has to include parents. Any educational space that seeks to make belonging for children that edges out the voices of families does not create a genuine space of belonging.
I do think it parallels well with the corporate world in that what you just said, you can't create a space of belonging when you're not talking to the people who are supposed to belong there. What I need to belong somewhere may be very different than what you need or what you need, Anthony. And so if we don't have those conversations, I think where people struggle, leaders and probably administrators alike, is how do we have those conversations? Because if somebody asked me, well, Natalie, what do you need to belong today? And I want y'all to like me. I want to, and we know what it looks like when people belong, right? We know that students are taking risks or employees are offering innovative ideas. But having that conversation, and maybe some of the teaching is around how do you for yourself, right? So you talk about, you do identity work on the front end, but maybe part of that identity work is also, what are the things that people are doing and saying that make you feel like you belong, versus what do they do and say when you walk in and you're like, I'm going to be at this district for 1 year and I am already applying for the next position.
I think on the corporate side, though, that's why you see employee resource groups or business resource groups are developed. And also you'll see now, especially in the work that we do, the focus on being more, not only just human-centered, but being a good human.
Yes.
I think that generally kind of where it comes down from. Again, of course, it's problematic of what people think being a good human means, but some people don't care. Again, it's not innate to them. They're not, some people are not empaths. I am not one of them as well. So I'm one of those people that I had to learn how to be more empathetic and how to learn to be more open and human-centered in my and creating psychological safety. It was an advanced skill for me. That struggle came from learning. Well, the learning came from struggle, as you mentioned earlier. So I think that's what I see the analogy is. It is the efforts to create those business resource groups where you can have a voice. Basically, what it boils down to, that becomes a voice within the population. But to your point, I think that's something that I've done some youth center work before, and it was a strong push to making sure that youth were at the table and to avoid the ageism that those of us who have a little gray hair and a bit older are thinking, I know everything and I know what's best for you, without hearing from the end user or the person that I'm trying to help. So I think those are the links between the educational space and between the corporate space.
And that co-creation, when you say like we have differing ideas of what it means to be human, a good human, that's why we have to co-create it, right? How do we then come to shared language and shared understanding, which might mean some compromise, right? In classroom spaces, people like to talk about respect, right? It's a classroom expectation, respect. Well, what does that mean? And how will I know that I've disrespected you if culturally respect looks a certain way? And so it's not just to say that we want to be good humans. We have to co-create what that means for us in this space, and then what it looks like in this space, because what it means to be a good human sometimes at work and what it means to be a good human at home might look different.
They
right?
should look different.
Right?
Let's hope.
Yes, because
yes.
so
Yes, it should look different. Let's make that clear.
For a lot of reasons.
a lot of reasons, some legal,
Mostly legal.
right? So co-creating that together and having those discussions together, I think, is really important.
Yeah.
In educational spaces or corporate spaces.
So I think the big take-home point, how do we humanize people, whether that's students, whether that's parents, whether that's teachers or administrators? How do we collectively design our expectations? How do we collectively design our space, our definitions of things like what it means to be a good human? And then how do we support one another through that, right? And, you know, how do we ultimately support students, but recognizing that if I'm not showing up as my best, it's really hard for me to support 25 kids in a classroom who are all very different and have very different needs. And so recognizing that also you have to support teachers through their support of students.
Great summary,
Thank you.
Dr. Parks.
You know.
And thank you, Dr. Grove, for being with us today.
Yes, thank you so
This was
much.
a wonderful conversation.
Wonderful conversation. And again, we were honored to have you as our first in-studio guest. So we will share this with you, and hopefully our followers find it just as exciting as I did, because you dropped some gems. I was like,
She always does.
I was like, wait a minute. I'm gonna feel like
Let me take some notes.
I don't have to take notes. It's recorded. So, but thank you again. We appreciate you coming on, belonging at the top, and we will spread this far and wide to our listeners.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
And remember that great leadership starts with belonging.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Belonging at the Top. We hope it sparked new ideas for fostering belonging in your leadership journey. If you found it insightful, please like and subscribe to our podcast for more thought-provoking discussions. We'd also love it if you could share it with others who might benefit from the conversation. If you have any feedback or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please email us or drop us a note on Instagram or